asking to make a speech. My boss from the World Bank country thing has told me that I should ask each of them one challenging question. So I will begin with Dr. Hoffman. Dr. Bert Hoffman is the World Bank's chief economist for East Asia and Pacific, and he's also the director of the Singapore office. He was previously the country director for the Philippines, and prior to that, he was the lead economist in China. He's also worked in Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, Mongolia, Gambia, and Namibia. I must say that of all the countries he served in, the one that is closest to his heart is Indonesia. The reason is that he's married to a very lovely and talented Indonesian woman. His wife is more famous than he, the wife. Shanti, no, it's true. She's more famous than he. Her name is Shanti, and she's a very famous filmmaker. And I'd like to make a commercial pitch. her new film called The Dancer will be screened publicly soon. And all of you should look out for it. It is an important movie because it tells through the life of a dancer, this very traumatic period in Indonesian history, 1965. Now, the question for Dr. Hoffman. Is growth becoming more weightless? That is less a function of capital investment and more dependent on ideas and innovation driven by human capital and R&D. Does this mean that countries can grow at 6-7% rates of growth, gross domestic investment as a percentage of GDP to a low 20% rate?
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction of me, and I should also thank you for this very difficult question. Because it is a very interesting question in this chapter. Let me first pay my respect and compliments to the authors. I have to say, much of my learning on industrial policy and industrial development in East Asia, I have learned from Shaiji's or Shima. So I'm very grateful for the extensive work in this area. I have to say, there also an illustration of your own principles. Some small teams also do it better than others. It only takes two to basically write the whole history of the continent over the last 50 years. And indeed, it's becoming more weightless writing, I should say. I can't read as fast as you write books. So it's becoming easier and easier for you to write books. There's clearly an economy of scale, in fact, in the making. I find the question interesting. My honest answer is, it's too early to tell whether this is a model, whether this is actually a new growth model, whether this will be potentially a trend worldwide, and not just for small countries, but if it can be done in small countries, it can also be done in larger countries, because increasingly large countries are an agglomeration of many, many small regions, if you look at them, who do have their own policies, their own industrial policies, and could pursue similar paths. When I look at the aggregate statistics that are in the book, they're quite nice on how growth has been evolving, and increasingly you do see that the technological progress of TFP is playing an increasing part, but actually not human, that's not human development, not so much human capital, but the unexplained part. And I think we have yet to think about what that unexplained factor is. Part of it is China. Don't underestimate China, because China is known for its very high investment rate, for its very high savings rate, and now the order of 50% of GDP both. But actually TFP still contributes 1/3 of growth in China. China is 1/3 of growth lately on the world economy. So it is, and that's, I think that's different from the model that we're talking about. That is more broader. You also see it in India. You see it in some of the other somewhat larger some of the larger developing countries, if you want the BRICS, that are now starting to catch up. Yes, there may be less weight or more TFP. We don't quite know what that is, but if you dig into it, I think there is still a lot of fairly classical transformation, if you know, the Lewis transformation of getting resources from unproductive, or from less productive to more productive sectors. Most dramatically, that was in China, i.e. from agriculture into industry, and now gradually going into services, even though that is still heavily underdeveloped. And that creates TFP. At the same time, I think for growth on a sustained and long-term basis, it still seems to me unlikely that things become weightless. Singapore was definitely not weightless 20 years ago. I mean, I remember the writings of Krugman, whether they were exactly right or not exactly right. And I know that was hotly debated here. But 20 years ago, actually, the East Asian tigers were put up as an example of a lot of weight and not much growth, or at least not much productivity growth. And I think so. We're also in a phase where a lot of countries now going through, if you want, they've done the basics, and they've done the basic investments in the infrastructure. Now in a second phase of growth that looks a little different, and maybe a bit less weightless. A lot of the perceived overinvestment in a number of countries is actually something that they're still using as infrastructure. And so if you look at China, which spends about 10% of GDP now on infrastructure, which will last 30, 40 years. They do it very rapidly, in part, let's not forget, in part because the price of capital is very low at the moment, so they should push very rapidly. But then you use that for the last 30, 40 years, and forgive me, I forgot the detail, but maybe Singapore in the 70s and 80s invested a lot in what you now see as the infrastructure, which showed up as very low productivity numbers, but actually it was a much longer term investment. So in other words, the measure of TFP did not really match the use of the capital over a very, very long time. So I think we have to be careful with those numbers, and they're now concluding that actually we have weightless growth in fairly late stage, if you want, industrialized societies, as all three sci-fis were. We still have to be a little bit. At the same time, what I do believe, and that's more general than just the sci-fi countries, catch-up growth is easier once you get it right. Once you get the basics right, once you start working against growth, it is far easier to imitate rather than to invent anew. And if you are inventing anew, you waste more capital if you want in ventures that are maybe not as productive as you originally thought. Catching up is simply easier, so you make less mistakes, and you can also adopt, which among others China has done, but also other countries. You can also adopt a far more efficient technology which is already on the market. You just integrate it to the country. So that may require less investment per unit of growth going forward. That's the optimistic side. I don't think we can go completely weightless. There's one key reason for that, and that is, if you look at the economic numbers, you still see a very strong correlation of investment and industrial growth. Countries that produce industry, manufacturing industry, they invest a lot. And because it requires the factories, but also requires the infrastructure to get the stuff in and out, and increasingly so because of the production networks that they're developing. Manufacturing industry is still an enormous driver for job creation and public creation. And the higher end, it's nice if you have a lot of engineers and if you have a lot of universities to train the engineers. That's usually a fairly late stage development. But if you want to look at development and getting people out of poverty and getting that relatively easy, manufacturing industry still seems to be the way to go. So for many countries, you still would want to follow that route of going to manufacturing industry. Even India, which is, they started as weightless growth, i.e. based on service export that kicked off the growth in the 90s. Well, they're moving into manufacturing. It's still in Singapore as well, but also if you see in India, you see they started fairly weightless in the services sector. They have 20% of GDP in investment. Now actually the big growth is coming increasingly from manufacturing, 33% of GDP in investment. So they're becoming weightier as they grow. So I think yes, it really has a development wait list. I think it will not be in the short term, it won't be the big poverty alleviation and the employment creation machine that countries need politically or otherwise. And therefore, we still see quite a bit of wage growth going forward. And that's unfortunate.
Let me now introduce the second panelist. I'm very pleased that we have a colleague from Africa here, because we would like to see whether this sci-fi novel has any relevance to Africa and can be customized and extrapolated to African countries. So I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Yao Ansu from Ghana. I don't know why Ghana produces so many bright people. My long years in the UN convinced me that there's something in Ghana that produces bright people. And not just Kofi Annan, and not just you. But Dr. Ansu is the chief economist at the African Center for Economic Transformation, which is based in Accra, in Ghana. And prior to joining the center, he spent 26 years with the World Bank and held many important positions such as research economist, country director, director of economic policy, head of the economist sector board, etc., etc. And so my boss, Jipeng, would like me to ask you to answer this question. Ireland and Singapore have relied on FDI to develop manufacturing and tradable services. Looking ahead, especially at Africa, can late starters and middle income countries count on MNCs, or only very few large countries have that option? Will MNCs continue to influence the pace and development of industrial diversification and growth in Africa?
Thank you, Mr. Cole. It's nice to be back in Singapore. In fact, it's very heartening to see that a series of steady course of policymakers that deepen and started in the bank, in the sense the last output of it being this book that Shahid and Cole so expertly put together. And actually I enjoyed reading it, and so congratulations to you. Regarding the question, of course, in this day and age, small countries have to be export-oriented, which is a big part of the SAFA message. And then with today's world of globalized supply chains, mostly controlled by multinationals, they are very central actors. So, at least up to now, have been very central actors in this story, particularly of Sapphire, but not only Sapphire, many other countries in the world. The question is, will this model continue to go? Let's not forget, this model was built on two principal factors. One was the quest for relatively cheap labor by mostly Western multinationals and Japanese. And there was this whole period, in the post-World War II period, high growth in the OECD countries, and aligned to that high growth was the opening up. And so there was the US and Europe, in a sense, provided a demand locomotive for this type of model to be successful. As we sit here right now, unfortunately, those two fundamental bases of the MNC model are under question, at least from the point of view of small countries of South Africa. If you look at the role of cheap labor, it's very hard now for many countries to really compete on the manufacturing side with China that can really provide huge and army surplus from the rural areas coming to the city. They can produce on scale, and in many ways they are relatively more productive than, say, many of the labor in many of the developing countries, certainly. So there's that question: can you compete with?
Chinese wages are rising.
Are they rising fast enough for it to be undercut? That's one of the questions. And in the train, not far behind China, as India begins to maybe move away, diversify from services and also step out in manufacturing, that's another, I mean, several hundred million people that are coming into the train. So the outlook is a bit muddy for other candidate starters in terms of trying to compete on this cheap wage model, assembly model. And then if you look at the other side of the other driver, the growing import demand from the world. We all know since 2008, I mean the economic crisis that hit the US and Europe. Now, how are they going to react? I mean, how are these countries going to react? Obviously, as incomes go down or the outlook, the gross profit goes down, I mean, would the type of import demand that we've seen in the post-war period in these countries continue? How would the governments in these countries react in terms of the tax policies that allow make it profitable for multinationals to increasingly produce outside? Even the U.S. now is beginning to talk about bringing in new fiscal rules that restrict the ability, virtually makes it more expensive for multinationals to go out. So that's a question mark. Would the trade policies continue to be so liberal? We don't know. But on the other hand, as I said, it's very difficult to also these days to get into the export-oriented growth process with given the increasing control of the multinationals of the global supply chain, how you actually get in there without being part of the process. So it's a question mark that I think most of us in Africa, that when we look at where do we go, think about. So in that sense, in a way, it makes the software model a bit relevant in the sense that I think it will require more than just competing with just low-skilled labor at the very low end of the scale. It's very difficult to compete with China. So one possible option will be for these countries to very quickly ramp up their educational and skill development skills and to find niches. Fortunately, at least for many African countries, they have resources. And unlike maybe what Shahid said about small countries without resources, having to do that skills, I still think even small countries with resources also have to develop skills, rather than, as in the past, exporting these resources in the raw form, having the skills to process a bit more maybe like Finland in your sample than say Singapore or Ireland. And it could also be that if you're lucky, and then we begin to track the development of multinationals in the South, and you begin to have much more South-South trade, then maybe there'll be a new way, a new code, that the South will provide a demand of commodity that will possibly keep this tendency driven. But it will be a different type. Instead of South-North, it may be increasingly more South-South. Although, South-North will continue. And so as I look at it, in a way, the outlook's a bit cloudy, but it's also exciting because I see personally that we are at a stage where things are in a flux. And the old paradigm is changing, nobody really knows where it's going. And in there, we like areas, but also opportunities for newcomers to come in and to take advantage. So I also see opportunities that we need to look for. And a lot of that opportunities we will only realize if we really work hard on the skills development. So in that sense, the SAFA or the skill-based development is very, very important.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? One small country in Africa that has sought to emulate the Singapore model is Rwanda. The merit of the book is that it says geography doesn't matter. You may be peripheral from the center of the world, but it does not matter. Resource endowment doesn't matter. So Rwanda is a landlocked, small country, isolated. The President Paul Kagame is in love with Singapore. He thinks that if he emulates the Singapore model, this is the future for Rwanda. He sent people here for training. So for him, the development of the human capital is very important. And unlike most developing countries, he pays for it. He doesn't ask for technical assistance, but he pays for it. And I think he's also emulated something about Singapore which is not in the book, which is the rule of law. The rule of law in Rwanda. Rule of law, open economy, welcome foreign investment. So could you just tell us how Rwanda is doing? And do you think the SANY0008 model is applicable not just to Rwanda, but for your own country, Ghana?
I've only been to Rwanda once, but of course I follow its development. I wouldn't claim to be an expert. And in fact, as we speak, I have a study being done for me, ASSET, my organization, a study being done for us on Rwanda and 14 other countries in terms of their transformation performance in the past 30 or so years. I think one thing that Rwanda has that is a bit, very much like Singapore, a very determined and committed and disciplined leadership. And that's central. I don't think that came out as well in the book, but I think, that's where you start. And then Rwanda being a very small, landlocked, and very resource poor country, and also in some sense, a bit like South Africa, having gone through a very difficult historical period that made them say that never again. I just sort of concentrates the mind. And so to that extent, they had a discipline that many of the countries in the region don't appear to have. Another one that seems to be going in a similar direction, and probably taking more inspiration from Japan, is Ethiopia. They also be very, very disciplined in that direction. My own country, I'd like us to see, I think we do have a prospect. People have come to Singapore a number of times and other places, and also studied Malaysia. I don't think the discipline and the single-mindedness of the leadership is there yet, the way that we have. And I think it's also complicated a bit by the fact that you take a good with the bad in the sense that for what is worth, Ghana now has a very active, dynamic, and very competitive political system, with governments changing every 4 years. So in that sense, it's become very difficult for that to consistently pursue a long-term vision that you need for this type of Now, Ireland and Finland found a way through the cooperative system to bring the social partners together. And we need to find a way to do that in Ghana in order to have a consistency of policy that will make it.
I think the two authors have pointed out in their book that of course Singapore has the unusual privilege of having been governed by the same party for a long time, but Ireland and Finland are normal competitive democracies, and yet there was bipartisan consensus on what they should do for the country. There was a high level of resolve and commitment. So it can be done in Ghana.
That's what we keep saying.
The next speaker is a very dear friend, Vikram Khanna, one of India's gifts to Singapore. Like many illustrious Indians, he studied at Cambridge University. Worked at IMF, and then we persuaded him that he could do greater good for Singapore and the world here than in Washington. He's the associate editor of the Business Times. Vikram, I want to ask you a provocative question, not GA, too polite. Can you critique the book's description of the Singapore model? Are they too kind to us? Have we actually made that successful transition to an innovation-driven economy? Isn't it true that we are still overly reliant on massive injection of both investment and labor, especially labor, and that our although it is our new ambition to raise productivity, but we are struggling with it. So could you critique the Singapore model, tell us what the gaps are, and how the next edition of the book, maybe Shahid and Kaudu-san should be less kind to Singapore.
Would you maybe invite him back?
Thank you, Tony, for that kind introduction. But I think I'll follow Shahid's suggestion that we must first praise the book before we say anything bad about it. And the praise is genuine. I must congratulate the two of you on your incredibly prolific partnership. You produced something like 14 books together. It's unbelievable. For a team of writers. And almost every year, it's like a best-selling novel coming out of bestseller. No, but and I think this book, I've always tried to read whatever Shahid writes. I read him back in Washington. I think when he was lead economist on China, I think his account of the first decade of China is opening up. It's probably the best paper you could read on that from Shahid and his team. In this book, I think the authors have a very comprehensive picture of a lot of what these countries did right when it comes to witness growth and so on. I just had one question about the sample. I was wondering about this sample, and I would have thought that there were some countries that could have been included, like Israel, also a small country, also technologically capable, perhaps Estonia, another one, and perhaps Hong Kong, which although part of China now, was an already dynamic economy even before they handed over in 1997. And they share some of the characteristics of the economy. So I'm just wondering how the inclusion of those countries would have altered the conclusions of the book. But anyway, that by the by, I also think that many of the lessons from this book, could also apply to large economies. I don't think it's only small economies that can learn from this. At least regions of large economies. I'm thinking of, for example, the Hyderabad, Bangalore, Chennai triangle in India. They can benefit from knowledge of agglomeration economies, smart urbanization, clustering, some of the themes in the book. Similarly, I think certain provinces in China, which actually have a lot of administrative autonomy, would learn a lot from what's in this book. But okay, while it does focus a lot on what these countries got right, I think at least in Singapore's case, there could have been a little more discussion on what still needs to be done, on what is missing, as Tommy put it. First of all, the whole ICT story, information communication technology story, has by and large been a very positive one, but it has had its downsides. It did at one time produce very volatile growth in Singapore because it tied Singapore to the semiconductor cycle, which is extremely volatile. So in Singapore, there's a time when electronics accounted for half of Singapore's manufacturing exports. This is the sort of, and then Singapore diversified into pharmaceuticals and biotech, which also is very cyclical, but which does not, the cycle does not correlate with electronics. So that's okay. And then later on to tourism, which I think integrated resorts and so on, which has been a great success. So I mean, so ICT has been in some ways a kind of a mixed blessing. And while we have been the winners, it has produced winners, it has also produced casualties. I mean, there have been a lot of resources poured into companies, Chartered Semiconductor, for example, which they fought very bravely in a highly competitive cutthroat industry, wafer fabrication. But it didn't make it. Eventually, it ran several years of losses and was taken over. So there have been casualties in this business as well. Other things, well, take patents, for example. I mean, the book talks about the great success that Singapore has had, and we have some of the other countries as well, in generating creative patents. Well, fine, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And in this context, the eating is revenue streams. I mean, the patents have not really translated into revenue streams for companies. The book mentions, for example, A-Star, NUS has owning a lot of patents. Well, we haven't had anything that's come on A-Star, despite decades worth of investment, billions of dollars. We were told at the time, 10 years ago, that you've got to wait 10 years at least. But 10 years have passed, now they say you've got to wait another 10 years. Even when good products have been produced, they have not been able to gain traction. Take the example of creative technologies. Zen, which the creative MP3 player predated Apple's first iPhone. It came first. And yet, it was not able to give the product traction. I mean, I don't know the whole story, but the IT experts tell us that what was designed were things, the design was missing, elements that were missing included design, commercialization, marketing, branding, the whole understanding of the consumer.
What we didn't have is Steve Jobs.
We didn't have Steve Jobs. There's another interesting case of, do you know that does anybody know that the thumb drive, the USB thumb drive, was invented in Singapore by a Singaporean company? Does anybody know the name of the company? Check. Sorry? Check, correct, got it, go. He's not widely known, but he's a very knowledgeable guy. It's called Trek 5000. Trek as in Star Trek. Okay. Now, it should have been a star for the company, but it's like faded into obscurity. So it had this wonderful invention and did not or could not patent it robustly enough. Take it far away, take it to make it big. Now, of course, everybody produces thumb drives without regard to Trek's patent. So that's another case of even when you do something, you don't have this whole suite of capabilities to do it fully, to do it properly. I should also mention Nokia in this context. You had referred to Nokia on your screen. Nokia's story, it was basically a victim of an industry disruption, where the advantage shifted from handset makers to software producers. It's iOS and Android, which harness the collective wisdom of application developers around the world. They were the winners. Nokia was it flying high from 90s till about 2005, and then it just lost it. And its descent has been very dramatic. I wouldn't write it off, especially after its new partnership with Microsoft, but it's clear that, as you mentioned, it's become a follower, and it's no longer a leader than it was. I might also mention here CSM, which I already referred to, Chartered Semiconductor, which is also, a victim of, it's a highly competitive cutthroat industry that needs enormous financial staying power, enormous R&D resources and skills, and it just didn't have it. So I think some discussion of what is missing might have been helpful. Now, finally, on learning and innovation system and the whole ecosystem that we have here, while yes, the government has done a fantastic job in seeding a lot of things, when you look at private venture capital, it doesn't invest very much in Singapore. You have dozens of private venture capitalists here, as well as private equity players, but nearly all of their investments are outside Singapore. And you wonder why, which makes the government is the biggest VC in town. But even here, on its investments, the winners are not easy to find. And maybe it's still early days, but it hasn't been a fantastic record. And I would suggest that Singapore probably still has a lot to learn from places like Silicon Valley in terms of incubation, industry, university links, the whole process of mentoring, and so on that goes with venture capital. So I think we're still pretty far away from having arrived. So, but on the whole, I found this fantastically stimulating, enjoyable book to read.
Thank you, Vikram. The final speaker is a very, very good friend, Mr. Yo Lam Kiong. Lam Kiong spent 26 years working at GIC, one of the two sovereign wealth funds of Singapore. The last position he held was Chief Economist and Chief Strategy. He retired early in order to live on the moral earnings of his wife, which has always been my ambition, but not accomplished. Lam Kiong's greatest achievement is that he married one of my girlfriends, Talai Ah-Eng, whom I recruited to join the Institute of Policy Study, who's now teaching at NUN, in the Asia Research Institute. She's a wonderful scholar, and she had edited two landmark books on Singapore. For those of you who have an interest in understanding how Singapore has overcome many problems of the past to achieve the kind of harmony we enjoy in racial diversity and religious diversity, please read Lam Kiong's wife's two books, which are published by Lily. So, Lam Kiong, I'm going to ask you the easiest question. Looking to the future, what are the growth prospects of these three sci-fi countries in the coming decade? And what might be the sources of their future growth?
Thank you very much, Tommy, for pointing out that my wife is the smart one in the family. And but you're wrong in one, and and thank you for allowing me to marry her. You're wrong in one respect about my wife. You mentioned that unlike your wife, she doesn't tell you that you're an idiot all the time. I hasten to tell you that you're absolutely wrong. She does tell me that all the time. So, on that note, I'd like to try and answer the question. Question is a very interesting and difficult question. The first thing I'd like to do is congratulate Shani. Cool. Excellent book. It's very thought-provoking. It asks all the right questions. What is the growth model of the future given the current constraints? We see the obvious elements of correctness in the thesis that there are elements within the sci-fi that show a way. The biggest difficulty I have is that it probably shows the way for middle income to a more developed level. But the elements of good governance, but the elements of niche, non-manufacturing specialization, I think are valid and very interesting indeed to pursue further, and I hope you understood. It will, certainly help move towards the grand theory of redevelopment Shahid is elusively searching for that holy grail. I think it's extremely worthwhile quest. Growth prospects, I think the first thing I'd like to say though is that sci-fi within it embodies quite different intra-sci-fi models. Within sci-fi, there are quite different approaches. And I think the two poles here would probably be represented by Finland and Singapore. I'd like to talk a bit about some. These have, I think, the relevance for the prospects for growth, the pattern of growth ahead. The question simply, where is the prospects? The prospects are good, but the sources will be productivity growth. But here I'd like to point out that there are two alternatives. You asked the question, can waveless growth of 6 to 7% be accomplished maybe for developing countries? And well, for developed countries, I'd like to point out that Singapore has been the only developed country that has achieved 6 to 7% in the last 10 years at a very high level of per capita income, something which is good. And this is a direct function of the fact that Singapore, as opposed to Finland, to a lesser extent Ireland, has had a very different growth model. In fact, Singapore in the last 10 years has had a labor-intensive growth model in which most of the growth was because of the addition of labor inputs rather than productivity growth, as opposed to Ireland, and especially Finland, where most of the growth was because of labor productivity and total productivity. Singapore has had low total productivity growth and negligible labor productivity growth, I think, for a long time. But the 6 to 7% was largely labor supply from a very open immigration policy. So if you like Singapore, achieve 6 to 7%, fairly waveless growth, but importing a lot of foreign labor. And so most of that 7% was labor supply, and percent or less was productivity growth. Whereas in Finland, there was hardly any labor supply growth. Most of it was productivity growth, 3-4%. So Singapore achieved a higher rate of growth, but the quality of growth that it achieved with this model of, if you like, recapitulating the early stages of the Lewis model at a high level of per capita GDP and productivity as a model, proved to be unsustainable because what happened was that it accentuated, if you like, because of the massive import of labor, accentuated income inequality, it contributed, reinforced stagnation of median wages, it in fact depressed real wages where they bottom 20% of the spectrum. So, if you like, it was a form of immiserizing growth. It was a form of growth in which most of the share of labor actually, the share of GDP went to capital, and a decreasing share of GDP went to labor. Proved to be politically unsustainable, of course. It's been recognized by authorities that to be unsustainable. The subject of the Economic Strategies Committee proposals going forward, delivered by and reinforced by Finance Minister Mr. Farman in the last budget, reconfirms a commitment, therefore, to reverse the strategy and actually reduce immigration to rates of growth that are only consistent with the local domestic labor supply growth. Therefore force firms to rely on productivity growth. Because in the absence of labor supply, you have to upgrade TFP, you have to invest in machine repair, etc. So it is a repudiation of that model and a reaffirmation of the Finnish model. And I think that has to continue. The good news here is that Singapore has a lot of catch-up potential because for so many years, if you like, we have depressed the wages of the people working at the bottom. A recent study by Oakmont, very cursory study, shows that construction workers in Singapore earn, let's say, $1,000 a month. In Hong Kong, they earn $2,500. Plumbers in Singapore earn $1,500 a month. Plumbers in Hong Kong, $3,000. Nurses in Singapore earn $2,000 a month. Nurses in Hong Kong earn $3,500 because Hong Kong is more disciplined about labor supply. Hong Kong, in fact, followed more, if you like, Finnish kind of productivity driven, maybe Irish kind of productivity driven. Ireland's probably in between. And that's an important line. Therefore, to focus on productivity growth, I think, is the takeaway within sci-fi. Now, broadly more speaking, I'd like to also point out with respect to dependence on MNCs and another big difficulty, which is the sci-fi models when faced. If I always sort of broadly characterize them within sci-fi, I think you have Finland on the one hand. It's got a high level of social protection. It's got a low level of social inequality. They're very egalitarian, they're a true egalitarian society. And it's got a high, even though it's got good all the good industrial capability, it has a high level of domestic industrial capability. Okay, Nokia, yeah, that's obvious, it's having problems, but you mentioned Wasili, you mentioned Kone, there's Rapala, there's Angry Birds, in a whole range, right? Medium-sized enterprises, knowledge-based enterprises, IT-based enterprises that are finished, essentially, in capability. Whereas in Singapore, there's capital and one or two, but in terms of domestic control of the economy, it's largely foreign owned. So this domestic versus foreign, high social protection versus low social protection, and high inequality because of that growth model that I referred to versus low. Now, which of these two, and Ireland's between, so which of these two is likely to succeed in the world of the future? Let's look at the world of the future. What do we see? What we know is a lot unknown, but we know that there's going to be an inexorable rise of India and China and all the problems that we discussed on the panel with respect to their rise. The chief labor market problem for developed countries and other developing countries is, well, I think Lawrence Freeman of Harvard put it well. He says the good news is that we're going to eradicate poverty in Asia. We're going to end with the Myrtle's Asian drama on a happy ending. As we did in Western Europe, that's the good news. The bad news is that it will come at the expense of the poor in the rich world. So that's the bad news and the good news. Because of the competition of this great doubling of the world's labor supply, the wages will tend to be depressed among the low-income people with whom they compete in the rich world. So that is an inexorable trend number one. Trend number two, as we pointed out, is that the West is in a relative decline that's being exacerbated by a deleveraging from the last great recession, which will be manifested in also government budget crisis throughout time, and high levels, unusually high levels of Keynesian and structural unemployment. So that's the West. Now, in this environment, there's going to be a lot of pressure, and Ansu mentioned from these governments to bring investment back home. Already the US is trying to make it difficult fiscally for MNCs to invest in low-cost production without those costs. The third trend is, of course, technology. Here, technology in manufacturing, which, as we pointed out, is really what the core, remains the core. I think that Dr. Hoffman pointed out, it remains the core of hope, even for India. India cannot bypass manufacturing because it's escaping the routine from the track. Even in manufacturing, technology here seems to favor or disfavor relative costs. Exporting direct investment because of lower relative costs. And what technology is doing, for example, holographic manufacturing technology, this technology, is making it more sensible to have production back home or close to the final market, as opposed to in several other countries where relative costs are the driver of location. So what that does, combined with the political fiscal incentives, is it brings MNC direct investment either back home to the States, to Japan, or to Europe, or pushes it to the big final markets like the BRICS, like China, like India, but away from everybody else. So in this environment, which is the better model? Is it the high social protection model, the egalitarian model, the one with high domestic industrial capacity, or is it the one with low social protection,